Welcome to The Author Show, where we feature new authors and books, from fiction to self-help and everything in between. You'll find it all at theauthorshow.com. That's theauthorshow.com. And now let the show begin.
Hello and welcome back to the show. This is your host, Don McCauley. Today we're welcoming to the program author Salvatore Esposito, and he is the author of The Sure Mercies. Salvatore, how are you?
Very well, sir.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
I'm just a regular blue-collar guy who loves to read and write. It seems to release some sort of endorphins when I do. I get real pleasure out of it. And I was born and raised on Long Island. At a young age, I fell in love with the diverse population on Long Island. It exposed me to so many great cultures and influences my writing even today. And when I was in high school, I'd heard our military was the greatest of all melting pots, and my love for diversity and desire to further explore it really motivated me to join the armed forces. So I served in 6 years in the U.S. Army, including a year in Iraq, and serving as a medic with different types of folks really opened me up to all walks of life. It gave me an even better understanding of human beings than my upbringing on Long Island. And after I got out of the Army, I took a blue-collar civil service job. On the side, I began writing and about all my experiences on Long Island and in Iraq. And my first book was published by McFarland Publishing. It is my first-hand account of my combat support hospital's role in the infamous Abu Ghraib prison after the prisoner abuse scandal. And after this was published, I was encouraged by colleagues to keep writing, so I put together The Sure Mercies.
So tell us about this book.
It is a Christian fiction story about learning how to gain freedom from the guilt and self-condemnation over past mistakes. The hardest person to forgive is yourself. And The Sure Mercy tells of a wounded Iraq War Staff Sergeant Benjamin Orry who visits the hometown of fallen comrade Uriah Landon to return his personal effects to his family. And one of the items is Uriah's personal journal. Brutal truths and heartbreaks in Uriah's final entries may damage the faith in many in the close-knit town. And for the sake of peace, Ben considers not revealing the journal to anyone, but having witnessed Uriah's violent death, he feels he owes it to his memory to let his final entries be read. As Ben limps painfully through Uriah's neighborhood, he wonders what he'll do, what justice might be, and what several of Uriah's loved ones must do to have self-forgiveness. However, a series of encounters keeps hindering the well-disciplined soldier.
Now, who did you write your book for specifically?
Well, the book is written for anyone who is struggling with guilt or self-condemnation. I know at some point in my life I had struggled with guilt, and I wrote the book for anyone who wants to learn how to be free of guilt or shame or anything else that might hinder your life. You know, shame can have a life-altering effect on yourself. The byproducts of shame can actually even affect the people around you. And I wrote the book for Christians, regular people, even people who aren't struggling with shame but might be struggling with it one day themselves. That's who I wrote the book for. You know, it could be a handy tool and a reference guide to learn how to let go of all the self-condemnation that might have a negative impact on your life and the life of those around you.
Is there a minimum reading age in the book?
Well, my characters are pretty much young adult age, and the main characters are in their 20s. But since shame can affect anyone at any age, this book can apply to anyone. And I hope that everyone would consider reading it just as a reference guide in case shame ever comes up on the person.
If you had to choose, what would you say is the single most important idea you're sharing in your book that's really going to add value to the reader's life?
Well, I think the one value is that no matter what mistake you have made, no matter how bad it may seem to you or to others, the sure mercies are God's no-strings-attached way to let go of all the negative, guilty emotions that try to stay in your heart, mind, and soul. I think that would be the central message of the book.
Now, if you could compare this book with any book out there we might already be familiar with, which book would it be and why?
Well, my book was inspired by 2 Samuel and the Psalms and the Bible, and the Bible is the #1 bestseller every year. And my book parallels the story of Israel's King David and Bathsheba. And Bathsheba was the wife of a soldier in David's army. And many only know King David from a Sunday school story as the young shepherd who slew the warrior Goliath with only a sling and a stone. David's life was chronicled throughout many books in the Bible, and it is said that no man was closer to God than David. But still, he could be as vulnerable to anyone when it came to temptation. And David was a warrior king who struggled mightily with shame over terrible sins and mistakes. And on many occasions, God had reassured David that he had totally and unconditionally forgiven him of everything, and that David's heir would reign on Israel's throne forever. King David wrote many of the Psalms in the Bible, but they still reveal that in spite of knowing that God had forgiven him, he still had a very hard time letting the shameful feelings he had inside go.
So what was the most difficult thing about writing this book?
Well, the most difficult part for me was just having to write about the death of a soldier. When I was in Iraq, I did witness the violent deaths of several of my fellow service members, and some of these men and women had actually been in the process of protecting our perimeter. So that has always been the hardest part for me. So I left those scenes out of the Shore Mercies because I had to write about the deaths of fellow soldiers in my previous nonfiction work. So that pretty much was the most difficult part for me, writing about the death of fellow service members.
What was the hardest scene to write in this book?
Well, the hardest scene for me to write in this book was just dealing with the personal shame and having the characters go through all that again. It kind of made me feel the same emotions of guilt and everything, and just to know that the struggle that they were having inside, that the answer to their problem was right there in front of them, but they still wouldn't embrace it because they kept hindering themselves because of the shame that they were feeling. They wouldn't allow themselves to be forgiven. It's like they kind of embraced the shame. So that was kind of the hardest part, was just to relive all that stuff, because I've dealt with a lot of shame in my life too.
In your opinion, what's the most difficult thing about writing characters from the opposite sex?
Well, for me, I'm a guy who grew up with 5 sisters, and I learned what the right things to say are, and I definitely learned what the wrong things to say are. I have the scars to prove it. But as much as I learned about girls and women growing up, I learned a lot, and it did help my writing, but I have to say that even though I know a lot, I still don't know everything. But for me, it's a lot easier than other writers who never grew up with sisters or who don't have a lot of experience being married. But for me, it's okay, but it's still not easy to write about women. I still don't get everything right.
So what period of your life do you find you write about most often?
The old saying is to write about what you know. For me, I write about my years as a soldier. And you can live a lifetime in itself while serving your country. And those years gave me a lot to say. And it's like with John Steinbeck. I mean, his upbringing in the Salinas River Valley, that really influenced his award-winning works. And Ernest Hemingway, all the death that Ernest Hemingway saw in World War I, that really influenced his writing. He seemed to be chasing death in his books. But for me, my years as a soldier is really what I write about most.
What about your environment or upbringing? Did that play any major role in your writing?
Oh, yes. Whether I realize it or not, my upbringing on Long Island, it can just subconsciously sneak into my writing. I grew up in a very diverse, populated area. I was exposed to so many different cultures. A lot of migrant men and women come to the towns of Long Island to find work, and I was exposed to so many different Spanish cultures, and I became an aficionado, as Hemingway would say, and I learned a lot about people and a lot about human nature, and I didn't always have good experiences. There was a lot of hate crimes committed in my town, but I also saw a lot of the good, too. And it was a really good balance. It really opened me up to people from all different walks of life and the struggles, and it really helped me to understand the struggles of men and women.
So what can you tell us about your genre and why you prefer to write in that genre?
Well, my first book was nonfiction, and after that I got hooked on Christian fiction. And I prefer to write Christian fiction because I like to help hapless characters apply Christian principles to their troubles and obstacles and help them overcome their troubles and obstacles through the Christian principles. It helps the characters grow, and hopefully it will help the readers grow.
So what's been your most rewarding experience since publishing this book?
I got a call from Florida from a woman who was struggling with shame over a failed marriage and a broken relationship it caused with her children. She called me after she read my book, and she wanted to learn more about the Shore Mercies, which are in the Bible. And after that, she really told me how much it turned her life around, how she was able to let go of all the guilt over her past mistakes, and now she has a new, fresh outlook on life. So that was, so far, been the most rewarding experience.
How would you describe your writing style?
I like to think that I have a style of my own. A lot of people compliment on the way that I might go off on a tangent in one paragraph, but by the next paragraph I come back to my point, and the tangent that I went off on really brings my points home. A lot of people have complimented me on that, and really like to think that I have a style all of my own too, but I think all writers feel that way too.
So who or what would you say influenced your writing the most?
For me, I really feel a divine presence when I'm writing. For me, it's been God's Holy Spirit who influences my writing the most. And a lot of other artists, not just writers, feel the same way I do. J.R. Tolkien felt the same way, as did C.S. Lewis, and even Plato. He said he felt a divine presence flowing from him when he was putting together his works. He actually called it divine madness.
So based on your experience as a writer, what's the one recommendation you would make to authors just starting out?
My number one recommendation is never give up. please keep going and keep writing. If I can do it, so can you. Just keep going, keep writing. There's a science to storytelling, and it is called the 3-act structure. You can take courses on it. You can read books about it. Stay true to that 3-act structure, and even if it means cutting out your favorite scenes. And staying true to the 3-act structure and that science will help you put together a great story, stay disciplined to it, and also just never give up, because I want to be the first person to read your work.
Other than selling your book, of course, is there anything else you hope to accomplish with it?
I really hope to reach the heart of hearts of people who are suffering from shame and guilt, that there is a way to let go of all those negative emotions, and you don't have to reflect back on it. I really hope to share that with everybody. You can actually not only forget those mistakes, but you can also let it go so that it cannot creep back into your conscience at a later time. You can actually help move forward and never have to look back with any regret or shame. And that's the number one thing I really want to help people with.
In your opinion, who should buy your book?
I really don't want to sound like a sales pitch or I'm trying to sell the book. At some point in life, I think everyone's going to struggle with shame or guilt. And this story is based off of biblical principles, and I think that even if you're not struggling with guilt at one time, there may be a time that you will. And this can be a handy guide a quick reference guide to learning how to let go of the shame and the guilt. So anyone who is struggling or anyone who is hurting, or if you know of anyone who might be hurting, this could be a good thing to have on your shelf to help combat that.
Do you have a website?
I do have an author page at Amazon. If you type in my name, both the books will come up, and it actually includes videos and pictures of where I was in Iraq and what that work was all about as well. I actually do have a Twitter page as well. My tag name is Author Sal. If you can't afford a book, just hit me up on Twitter, and I will get you one out for free.
Could you spell your name for us, please?
Sure. It's Salvatore Esposito, Salvatore, Esposito, Esposito.
This has been just great. Our guest today has been Salvatore Esposito, and he is the author of The Sure Mercies. Salvatore, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you, sir.
The Sure Mercies. Salvatore Esposito. Orry had experienced the beauty of southern Texas years ago during his Army paramedic training in San Antonio. He hadn't expected to see it again. Now he was looking out the window of a Greyhound bus into the sea-blue Texas sky over Galveston. The mending bones in his left leg throbbed and ached. He'd been sitting on the bus for hours since leaving the Dallas Greyhound early that afternoon. At each stop in the cities along the way, Orry watched people get on and off the bus, wondering at the reasons for their comings and goings. Orry doubted their reasons were as important as his. He gingerly touched the small elevated scars on his neck as the bus rolled into the Bayside town. He'd put off getting skin grafts at the VA hospital in Washington, where he'd undergone 2 months of surgeries and traction. He'd spent another 2 months in rehab for his injuries, broken bones, torn ligaments, and third-degree burns on the right side of his body. He was now sufficiently recovered to make this trip to Galveston. The bus pulled into the Galveston Greyhound station around 5 p.m. The sun was lowering in the horizon and the heat of the day was fading. Orry, his body stiff, slung a black tote bag over his shoulder and got off the bus. He limped with an aching pain to the edge of the street to hail a cab. His right leg, its fibula broken, tendons and ligaments torn, stretched together and reinforced with metal pins, had not fully healed. His doctor said the pain would eventually go away. The limp would remain. The cab dropped him off in the parking lot of a single-level red-brick elementary school. It was Saturday and the parking lot was empty. He walked onto the lawn and stood in front of the school, the thick blue-green grass of fertile Texas soil. He squinted at his reflection in the sunlit glare of the school's plate-glass windows, a lone, trim figure with crew-cut hair and tan boots, blue jeans, and gray T-shirt. The black tote bag on his shoulder contained a change of clothing and items of Uriah's the armies hadn't sent home to his family. The weightiest items were his personal journal, with its burnt and blood-stained leather-bound cover, its pages singed at the edges but preserved, and his last letter to his family. They'd been retrieved by Uriah's fellow soldiers and sent to Sergeant Orry while he was in the hospital. He'd read the journal several times. It was like a written IED. If it were picked up and read by Uriah's family, it might cause irreparable harm and everlasting pain. The scorched journal, its sudden end inside scribble, and the preceding descriptions of Kelly and Pastor Darby's betrayal and Uriah's agony might be too much for them to bear. Orry walked away from the school toward Uriah's old neighborhood, feeling almost like he'd been here before. Uriah had spoken fondly to Orry and a few other soldiers about his old school, his neighborhood, his church, his life. He'd shared about Galveston's conservative religious townsfolk, connected to the Texas soil and one another, whose different generations regarded each other with respect, whose community was one of spirit, divided by no conflict of interest as God desired. Orry smiled as he recalled Uriah's story about how he got Kelly, the unattainable showgirl, to teach him to dance and fall in love with him. The plan, so clever and funny, revealed much about Uriah's mind and heart. Orry couldn't help laughing to himself at the memory, but his laughter was immediately followed by a pang of sadness over Uriah's death, and then a flood of anger at those who betrayed his friend and fellow soldier. He felt the journal press on him painfully like another unhealed wound. He had brought the journal, not sure what he'd do with it. He was so unsure he didn't inform anyone he had it. The weight of the unmade decision burdened his heart. He considered giving the journal to the Landons, but he couldn't bear the idea of handing them the journal with its burnt and blood-stained cover, or the thought of them reading the last anguished sections. He'd considered tearing out the anguished pages Uriah had written on the plane back from R&R and in the Humvee before the explosion, but that didn't feel right either. Orry also contemplated giving the journal to one of two others in Uriah's life. Should he give the journal to Kelly, the love of Uriah's life, or to Kelly's lover, Pastor Darby, the spiritual advisor who urged Uriah to join the army? He'd have to figure out which one deserved the journal most, then mull over the approach. While these seemed the two best options to Orry, he felt uncertain and apprehensive. He wanted to make the best decision for Uriah. He looked to the journal itself for guidance, but no clarity came from its pages in this regard. For an hour he walked the streets of Uriah's neighborhood, reflecting. Despite the ache of his injuries, walking helped him think and loosened the stiffness in his body. He saw reasons to do what he was inclined to do and reasons why he should leave the matter alone. Undeniable love nurtured and shaped Uriah, given to him by Galveston's townfolk, including Kelly and Pastor Darby. Orry had never met these two main characters who played such decisive roles in Uriah's final years. He didn't know what their feelings were, let alone the state of their souls. Yet he felt judgment against them on Uriah's behalf. He also knew that Uriah, steeped in the Gospels that nourished and shaped him, that sustained him in Iraq, would have counseled him, saying judgment belonged to God, not man. It might be better for him to simply deliver Uriah's last letter to his family, burn the journal, bury the ring, and leave Galveston without ever meeting Kelly and Darby. Yet he and his brothers in uniform, whose lives Uriah had also touched, wanted justice for Uriah, for they'd watched him sink into despair after discovering how he'd been betrayed. They'd seen his intense suffering in the 2 weeks before his sudden, violent death, and in a way, they hated the two people who caused Uriah such pain more than the unknown insurgent who'd planted the IED that took his life. In the light of Uriah's death, the love these two had given him seemed insufficient compared to the suffering they had inflicted on him. Delivering the journal into their hands would allow Uriah to have a final word with them from beyond the grave. But is this what Uriah would have wanted? Orry had come here to honor and repay a debt to Uriah for his service and his friendship. He had requested this mission. Staff Sergeant Orry, non-commissioned officer, was the officially designated deliverer of Uriah's last letter. It was his duty to present it to the Landons. Perhaps Uriah's sealed letter contained a closure sufficient for everyone. Its contents might give him the understanding he needed to decide what to do with the journal, but he could not violate the trust placed on him to break the letter's seal and read its contents. Orry had come to Galveston somewhat unexpectedly. He had informed the Landons about his trip only 24 hours ago. Something was telling him to come on short notice, and he didn't understand why. He was physically weak. Emotionally, he was weaker. He stopped in front of a one-story building and sat down on the grass with his back against a tree. He needed to rest, to listen to the quiet. Something deep in him beckoned his conflicted conscience to pardon trespasses, to not write his thoughtless or misguided actions into the last pages of Uriah's life. Better to leave these pages blank and allow those who loved him to write in them what they needed or wished. He closed his eyes for a while. Then a need to act forced him to open his eyes. He needed to get moving. Perhaps the clarity he wanted would come on the way. He had some stops to make before he went to see the Landons. This is Don McCauley wrapping up another edition of The Author Show. Please share this interview with your family and your friends so that they too may have the opportunity to discover our guest and his work. And why not spread the word on social media? We look forward to you joining us next time for another great book and another great author on The Author Show.
Thanks for listening to The Author Show. Find out more about authors and their work at theauthorshow.com. theauthorshow.com. Tune in next time to another great author on The Author Show.